Hey, I just want to extend great greetings to you tonight from the faculty, staff, and students from the College of Information and Communications here at the university. Thank you for braving the rain tonight to be here. I think you're in for a big treat, and we're very appreciative of that. Valerie Bauerlein is our distinguished Baldwin Lecturer in Business and Financial Journalism. I mentioned this before, but I really want to give sincere and heartfelt thanks to Ken Baldwin for making this opportunity possible, as well as for many additional ways that Ken has contributed to our program. He's here tonight with his daughter, Karen Fox, and if we can, I'd like to give Ken a big round of applause. Ken's a humble guy, but he has made a significant difference in the school, and again, sincerely appreciated. So I'm excited to have Valerie here for several reasons. Let me just share two. One, whether she realizes it or not, she is a member of our family. Now, as we know and we talked about before, she's a member. She worked at the State as a State House reporter in the early 2000s. She covered just a couple of characters like Strom Thurmond, Mark Sanford, as well as the 2004 presidential primaries. Does anybody know on the Democratic side who won that primary in South Carolina? Edwards, absolutely. Yes, right, over John Kerry. What's interesting to me and what I've learned since I've been here is the roots of our college are very closely aligned with the State newspaper. In 1923, William Watts Ball resigned as editor-in-chief of the State to become the first dean of the journalism school. So if you can do your math, that was 95 years ago. I hope we don't look like we're 95 years old if you've been in this building. So we are certainly moving forward and preparing for our next 100 years. But since then, literally hundreds and perhaps thousands of our students, alums, and faculty have worked at the State, and we take that relationship very seriously. I know that we have many of those with State connections here tonight. Now, Valerie, I know you're a Duke grad, but given your time at the State, we consider, Well, we consider you one of us, so you've officially become adopted. So congratulations tonight. Speaking of the State, I came across a quote from one of your former colleagues, Brad Worthen. He ran into you, and I think we just spoke about this a second ago, in 2009 when you were in town. And Brad wrote a blog piece that I was able to locate, and he said this about Valerie. He said she's one of the nicest, most pleasant, kindest, and most considerate people I've ever worked with, to the extent that you wonder how she ended up in the trade. He goes on to say, not that news people are universally unpleasant or anything, it's just that she was so nice and very good at her job to boot. And I think that speaks volumes of Valerie's character. Now I would like to introduce Andrea Tanner. She's the director of the school who invited and played a lead role in getting Valerie here tonight. Now Andrea will tell us a little bit more about Valerie's professional credentials. Thanks, Andrea.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to all of you here in the room tonight. I'm really thrilled to make this introduction, and I know there are a lot of you that do know her, but for those of you who don't, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her background. So she's a national reporter with the Wall Street Journal, covers economics and politics in the South. Her first job at the Wall Street Journal was in the Atlanta bureau. She covered banking and financial news. While in Atlanta, she broke big stories like the billion-dollar merger of Bank of America and Countrywide, and covered big businesses like Coke and Pepsi. She moved to Raleigh in 2011 and began a new beat covering politics and economics in the South. She's also spent much of her time covering disasters, both natural and man-made. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey, mass shootings at Virginia Tech, Emmanuel Church in Charleston, and most recently the tragedy last week at a Florida high school. So she's won prizes for her work, including her coverage of the opioid crisis and the poisoning of the water supply of a West Virginia town. She also says one of the perks of her job is the chance to write features about the American South. So she's written features about NASCAR, lawnmower racing, and Waffle House. And so for all of you who know South Carolina and the upstate, you'll be excited to learn that she's even written a story about the giant peach water tower that you see when cruising I-85 near Gaffney. She knows Columbia and the University of South Carolina very well. As Dean Riker mentioned, she's a proud alum of the state newspaper, where she covered the State House from 2000 to 2004. And, as he also mentioned, she's a Southern girl. She grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina. She graduated from Duke. She lives in Raleigh with her husband and her 2 children, who are 8 and 9 years old. And with that, let's give a very big Gamecock welcome to Wall Street Journal reporter Valerie Bauerlein.
Imagine your doorstep. I want you to imagine your doorstep when you get home tonight. And think about whether there'll be a package there. Whether there'll be a box of running shoes, a big box of paper towels. I want you to think about where you would have bought that 5 years ago. And now the hard part. Imagine where you'll buy that 5 years from now. Where will you get your shoes, your paper towels? The big question is, when you picture that doorstep 5 years from now, is will the drone that delivered them there be a one-use drone? Have they finally figured out how to do that? Or is it still one that has to fly back and forth to home base? I'm here to talk about retail, and the change in retail and the way we shop has happened gradually over years and not all at once. And not all at once was last year, in 2017. And 2017 was the year that changed retail history in this country. For 30 years, retailers have been expanding, building bigger and bigger shopping centers, more malls, more big box centers on the outskirts of town. Last year was the year that all turned around. More than 6,000 stores closed in 2017. And when you think about that, that's more than at the height of the Great Recession, which is a pretty stunning number. Because right now we're in a period, as y'all know, of economic expansion, low unemployment. And still, we can't sustain the level of retail that we have in this country. And what's really strange to think about is that this year is going to be on the same trajectory as last year. More stores to close. And some of the smartest analysts that we talk to at the Journal say that out of the 1,100 malls that are left in this country, another 400 will probably close in the next 2 or 3 years. And that's just really a wholesale change in the way we shop. And my final proof that I'll offer that last year was the year of the retail apocalypse is it was the year that retail apocalypse got a Wikipedia entry. So, you know, that's pretty much something, right? So this fundamental change has affected so many aspects of American life. I want to talk to you about how our change in how we shop has rippled out into your world and my world in 3 different ways. First, in taxes, property and sales tax, and the public services that we rely on them to fund. Second, in employment. Retail, believe it or not, has long been the largest employer in this country, largest private employer, responsible for 1 out of every 9 jobs. And so employment is changing rapidly. And then lastly, we'll talk about civic life. I talked with several of you in the hallway earlier just about how it seems like in almost every small town in South Carolina and everywhere else, oh, that mall is really struggling, or oh, that Sears left that mall. So I think we know intuitively that our civic and communities are changing quickly. So with that roadmap in place, I'd like to take a quick moment to say some thank yous. Thank you first to Ken Baldwin for inviting me here and for sponsoring and being a champion for business journalism. I really do believe, and I was telling a student this earlier, that all journalism is business journalism because it's integral to every aspect of our lives together. I'd like to thank the Dean for that introduction, which is very generous. But then also for the invitation, for having me here. And for Andrea, I really appreciate all the work that you did to invite me, and Rebecca for you. So thank you guys. And to all y'all, you know who you are, who I've asked to come, friends and colleagues, heads of cabinet agencies, heads of parties, spokesmen for Democrats, spokesmen for Republicans. From my political life, I really appreciate y'all coming out on a rainy night to talk with me. And you already heard a little bit about my South Carolina bona fides. I just wanted to prove them once more if I could. I've been at the Journal for 13 years and have had 60 stories on the front page. And I'm happy to say, I went back and looked, I was like, how many of those have been datelined in South Carolina? 16. It's a pretty good number. And that's presidential primary stuff. That's a lot of Mark Sanford stories. And a lot of stories about the changing technology in the upstate with the automotive industry. But as the dean mentioned, I do have a heart for features and for the American South, and so I am proud to have the distinction of being the only Wall Street Journal reporter to have written about these 7 institutions on the front page. Who does that? Me. Beauty queens. Beauty queens. Seriously. And as Andrea mentioned, the PhD. So, you heard a little bit about my background. I do cover economics and politics, but I have a great heart for corporate reporting. So in the past year, we've been talking a lot at the Journal about the kind of the corporate side of what's happening with retail. And we wrote a ton of stories about Amazon, really good ones, a ton of stories about Sears and Kmart, but there was a desire from the top to write more about what's happening in communities where retail is really changing. And for you students, I'll tell you that in my professional life of more than a few years now, the ratio of stories that I do really hasn't changed. There's about a third that are based on the news of the day. What happened today, you absolutely have to write about. And then there's about a third that are features, and whether that's more lighthearted things or more serious ones, like the rural-urban divide in the South, which is a defining issue that we have to grapple with, or other issues. About a third of what I write is features. And so that leaves the final third, which as you can probably guess, and I see several of my editors in the office, in the audience, are editor-driven topics. An idea that an editor dreamed up in a meeting. But luckily for me, the editors of the Wall Street Journal are some of the smartest people in the world. And my big editor, the one that you always say yes to, had an idea. We talk so much about retail, how it's melting down, how it's changing so quickly. Can we go to the community in America that is most affected by this and find out what it looks like, what's happening on the ground? So I'm going to tell you the story of the tax component of how things are changing, and then also the employment component through the lens of the city that I went to. It's Elmira, New York. So I am not a native New Yorker, as you probably have guessed. The upstate of New York was a new experience for me to go to, but it really is like a lot of other places. We chose Elmira because we looked at the technological, what data out there can send us where we want to go. How is it? I mean, you students, think about it. How would you try to figure out what city in America has been affected the most? We looked at employment data from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. And Elmira was the place that had lost more jobs as a percentage of population, 12%, than any other place in America in the last 10 years. And so if you lose 12% of your jobs in one component, you're a small town, that means a lot. So I started looking at Elmira, and it's a classic story. I mean, it's a town that is like a lot of towns here. It kind of boomed between the 1870s and the 1970s. It was a place that had great iron and gas works, and then it had incredible typewriter manufacturing. And then you moved on into the World Wars, and it made ordnance, and then it made television tubes. So you can kind of see American history moving through the economy of this little town. But when manufacturing withered away in the Northeast, retail really took its place. And what's interesting about Elmira is that it was the place where the local family said, you know what, we've got to protect our city. We know that malls are coming. We know all these outsiders are coming in to build malls. We're going to build our own mall. Put it right outside of downtown, and it'll be an economic driver to our economy for years to come. They built the mall in '67. You could predict that lots of people went to work there. It was the biggest mall in an 8-county area. It was a magnet for employment, for shopping, for all of these people. And then as the tax base withered away from manufacturing, retail picked up the slack. So it kind of gradually over time, retail and sales tax became the driver of the economic engine of this town. So what do you think happens when retail is propping up your economy and people stop going to the mall? They just order it on Amazon. In Elmira, it's been a very difficult situation. They rely on property tax, on sales tax for 25% of their local budget. And there's some budget people in the room who know that that's a huge number for an unstable amount, an unstable, kind of volatile source of revenue. 25% of their budget came from sales tax, whereas in South Carolina, it's about 4%. And in the rest of the country, it's about 7% for locals. So in Elmira, that's meant cutting police officers at the height of the opioid crisis. It's meant they want to revitalize their town. They want to attract industry, but how do you do that? You see projects, and they don't have the money to do that. So it's been one of those things that has been just a fascinating issue for this little town to grapple with. And sales tax, as I learned from my budget friends in the audience, is not growing already. It's not growing anywhere in the country. So online spending is growing at 27% a year. Sales tax is only growing about 2% a year. So even if people were buying at the mall, they wouldn't be collecting the sales tax. So what does all this mean to you? Well, it means that these little communities are just the communities that can afford it the least are struggling the most with the downturn in retail. And this is the chart of how we chose to go to Elmira. We pulled the numbers after, but you can see that these little towns here, industrial towns for the most part, lost jobs. And then it's the places that grew. Wouldn't surprise you. And this is the mall when it opened. And this is today. Another issue that I saw in Elmira in spades was property tax. And this is happening all over the country. Shopping centers are saying, we are not worth what we were 10 years ago. We're not worth 40 million. We're barely worth 20 million. We're asking the locals to reevaluate how much we're spending in taxes. Because for malls, I was surprised to learn this, but malls typically, their biggest expense is property tax. It's not rent, it's not salary, it's property tax. So this is a concern for public entities as well, because if property tax starts to decline and sales tax is not growing at the rate that it could, how are you going to pay for stuff? And we all know that the pressure to raise other sources of revenue is just intense. And one aspect that I found fascinating about property tax, and you may have heard of it, it's very honest. It's called the dark store theory. And there's this idea that some of the legislatures were familiar with, where malls want to be evaluated based on if they were dark. Because the mall down the street or the store down the street is empty. And that means we're less valuable than they were. So evaluate me like nothing's in it. Legislatures are fighting back on this, municipalities are fighting back on this, but it's an ascendant issue. And it really deadlocked the legislature up in Wisconsin last week to try to grapple with this change. So I would say these areas of public finance are just critical to our lives, our public services. And it's one of those ripple effects that you don't really think about when you think about, oh, I'm going to buy that from Amazon. And why is it? I should talk a little bit about why it is so hard to collect sales tax from online sales. Y'all probably know it intuitively. I imagine that you do. But when you go to Amazon and buy something from Amazon itself, they've started collecting sales tax in the 45 states that charge it. And that's a big deal. That only happened last year. And would you be surprised to know that Amazon sold its first product in 1995? So it took 20-some years to get Amazon willing to, or eager and able to distribute all that sales tax. But the other half of the online business is not collecting sales tax. And there's a mismatch of laws, and for the most part, they don't have to. If they don't do business in the state, or they don't sell above a certain dollar amount, they don't have to collect that money. And that's why if you go on Amazon Marketplace, you may not be charged sales tax in the same item that you would if you're just on the regular Amazon site. And that goes for Etsy and eBay and all the kind of third-party sellers that sell small businesses. And South Carolina has really been a leader in trying to take this issue on and say, hey, gosh, we can't provide services the level we need to if we're not getting the growth in sales tax that has been the case for years and years and years. And in South Carolina, the annual growth in sales tax over the past 20 years has been about 2.7%. But that doesn't keep up at all with inflation or population growth. So it's fascinating to think, well, there are billions of dollars left on the table that previously would have gone to public entities, and they're not doing that. So that's why this ripple effect is so fascinating to me. I'm going to switch gears and go to the second way third way, civic life. The civic life is, so I told you at the beginning that sales tax, property tax, and employment are two of the main ripple effects that have affected civic life, have affected how we live. And then the third that I wanted to talk about is civic life. What happens when you, in a community, if the mall goes away? So our story on Elmira ran out front. It got a lot of response. It got a lot of people that wrote in and said, hey, this is happening in my community. This sounds familiar to me. And when I drive around the South, I see ripples and echoes of dying malls and all these things. So the same editor, who's very smart, said, what if we go to a town where the mall has already died and try to figure out where people are shopping? Wow, how do we do that? We ended up going to a place that had a lot, also from that same BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, had lost a lot of jobs, but was doing quite well. And we chose a place called Wausau, Wisconsin. And Wausau is an incredibly prosperous place. It's the opposite of Elmira. It has a history as a logging town, so they grew up with all these kind of timber industries that's now housing and building windows and doors. At the same time, they came up with a lot of white-collar jobs because of the insurance agencies there. And timber is a pretty dangerous line of work, and so in Wausau, they started having a lot of white-collar work and a lot of blue-collar work, which is different in most communities. So my point is that Wausau is a place that's one of the healthiest communities in America. And Pew Research says it's, the most middle-class community in America, and yet the mall there completely died. The anchors left. The owners left, they turned the keys over. So it's the only mall in a 75-mile radius in rural Wisconsin. There's 400,000 people. Where are they going? Where are they shopping? So I went to Wausau 2 weeks before Christmas, and the glamorous life of Wall Street Journal reporter. I checked the weather forecast, and it was foreboding. I flew into Wausau in the middle, I got in about midnight. And I can remember this very clearly. It was in the single digits. And I was at the rental car counter and I said, hey, do you think I could make it 20 yards from the rental car counter to my car, which is right outside the door? The lady behind the counter was like, I wouldn't. Come on, really? And she was right. She was right. I was wrong. It was very cold. Doing man-on-the-street interviews when it's that cold is a force of will. But at any rate, I went to Wausau and I found it fascinating. So this is a place which is prosperous. It's doing great. Nobody's at the mall. I went to the mall. It's the other aspect of the glamorous life of Wall Street Journal. You get to interview the most interesting people. And this Santa had actually been at the mall for 20 years. And he comes out of tradition and love, but he doesn't come because there are a lot of kids. On Saturday, 2 weeks before Christmas, there was no line to interview Santa, put it that way. Well, what is happening in Elmira, which was really interesting, is that people are still shopping. You're shopping, I'm shopping. Where are we shopping? They're shopping online, and in Wausau, they're shopping online at a faster rate. There's many more people shop online there than other places, and we use some data from this provider called Slice, which can slice data. They look at your email receipts and find out where you live and what you're buying, and then they can say, well, in Wausau, Wisconsin, people buy 30% more stuff online than they do in Columbia, South Carolina, for example. So a lot of people buying stuff online in Wisconsin. It makes sense. It's rural. Stuff is far away. It's cold. But they're also still buying at the other place you see a lot of people and a lot of activity is warehouse stores, Costco. You go into Sam's Club on the weekend to stock up every other week. So the parking lot was packed at Sam's Club. But it's older shoppers, and that's going to be an interesting question for those big providers. Their demographics skews older, and they're grappling with that now. How do they figure out how to get young people in stores? What was really interesting about Wausau is you go downtown, and every single shop front was full, every single one. I went into this store called The Local, and it is all local goods. Everything in there is handmade in Wisconsin. And the owner, Allison in the glasses, had pictures of each artist who made each coffee cup and each coaster from everywhere up on the wall, explaining why they did what they did. And this place, you go there on Saturday, the doors being in every minute. People are coming in and out. And similar up and down the street, the little downtown shops are doing really well. So the differentiated things are selling, and people are going to this hyper-local, hyper-specialized environment. And I asked Allison, I was like, she's 26 years old. I was like, why did you start a retail business? I mean, what a leap of faith that is in this day and age. She's like, well, I'm selling stuff online on Etsy, and I thought how nice it would be to have a physical Etsy to go to. And that made total sense, really, when you think about it. The places that are doing well right now in communities, a lot of it, bookstores are having a renaissance, right? Places of community and something special, farmers markets, organic, something that's real, something you can't buy online. So what I found in Wausau is that people were not shopping at the mall, but they were still shopping. They're shopping online, and they're shopping at the Sam's Club, and they're shopping at The Local and all these little boutiques. And I should add, the way that it became clear to me that people were shopping online, in addition to the email receipts, was I tried to get a ride along with a UPS driver, which is a classic journalism tactic. I recommend it to you. Ask to ride along. It's fascinating. It never fails you never fail to learn something. And had it set up, and then they canceled. They're like, the drive, I'll take 5 minutes. I'll meet him at a house, like delivering a package, interview him, and then I'll get out of his way. And they're like, we can't spare 5 minutes. I called back the next day, and the PR people were out delivering packages. That's how the business has changed overnight for UPS, FedEx, all these providers. So I think that why we care is we still want to have retail in our communities. You talk to civic leaders, they want to have retail, but they're trying to figure out what the mystery is. How do we solve that? And it seemed like in Wisconsin and other communities, hyperlocal, it's still working for now. And the last thing about civic life I want to talk about is the malls themselves. These big buildings that you've been into, Brad's written about on his website. You might have all gone to websites like Dead Malls where they toured these malls that have not thrived. So the question in a lot of communities is, what do we do with this place? When you think about what a mall is, it's on a big open piece of land. It's got lots of parking, got lots of utilities. What could go in there? And that's what communities are trying to figure out. I know here there's discussion of using malls for county offices, and that's really an interesting proposal. It's happening in places. One of the things that you'll find is that malls are complex organisms, and some of the stores that are in the mall will have 10-year leases or 20-year leases, and some of the anchors are owned by Sears owns the Sears, Macy's owns the Macy's. So trying to pull together, it's not as simple as you would think to try and say, all right, we're going to change the identity of this mall. It's actually very complex. But in Durham, North Carolina, a lot of places, hospitals are the answer. There's a lot of parking, utilities, close access to downtown. They're putting in nursing facilities or doctor's offices. And I saw that in Elmira as well. One of the old Toys R Us buildings was a doctor's office, a Medicaid office. And, you know, the irony of ironies is that the highest and best use of some of the malls and communities has proven to be distribution centers for Amazon, FedEx. It's true. You think about it. I mean, it's by the highway. It's got big open delivery bays. It's open inside and easy to repurpose. Got lots of utility functions. So it's fascinating to think that as communities puzzling through, what are we going to do with these places? What are we going to do with retail in our communities? Because for eons, from the days of the ancient bazaar, retail has been integral to civic life, and that's changing, like I said, overnight practically. So I want to just take all your questions and about retail and about anything else, and then I'll close with some remarks in about 20 minutes, if that sounds good. But a request with your Q&A, if you would tell me who you are and try to keep your question as succinct as possible so we can get to as many as we can. Paul Osmondson.
Hey Valerie, thank you for welcome back to the Good Carolina. You mentioned the proposal at a company mall to get the county's going to buy 3 anchors and try to move the county offices out there. Are you familiar with any other place that has done that, and has it worked or not?
That's a great question. Paul's asking about other communities, whether they've succeeded in bringing county offices to a mall. It can work. It absolutely has worked. And I think it's a common first attempt, because the county and the civic leaders have a vested interest in making sure that mall thrives. There have been actually a lot of uses, repurposes of malls that have worked. There's one out in Colorado that has become like a senior living center. So just things you wouldn't think about. But yeah, there are places where that has worked for sure. Hi.
I'm Colin. I'm a freshman. At the beginning of your presentation, you asked us where in 5 years you think we buy like running shoes or paper towels.
Yeah.
In 5 years, where do you think you'll buy it from?
That's a great question. So Colin's asking in 5 years, where do I think I'll buy that stuff? I gotta tell you, and this is me as a person, not me as a Wall Street Journal reporter, it's just hard to know, right? Think about how powerful the phone is in your hand today versus even a year ago, much less. Who remembers their first iPhone? Not that long ago, 8 years or something. So I can't, it's hard to fathom the pace of technological change. I do think, and we've seen evidence of this, that driverless cars are happening a lot faster than even the engineers who make them have predicted. So I do think we'll see fleets of driverless cars getting delivered. I think drones, Amazon says, drones are happening. I have no reason to doubt that. But it's hard to say. It's so hard to imagine. I mean, can you imagine a community without stores? We'll still have them, right? It's a great question. Where do you think they'll go? Where do you think they'll go?
I don't know. I'm from Philadelphia, so
Yeah.
the mall there is where everybody goes. But recently, like when I go to school here, I've been buying stuff off Amazon. I just feel like that's only going to get bigger.
The mall in Philadelphia is still very, very thriving, and that's a point I should make. There is a differentiation between malls and urban centers that are wealthy and densely populated. They can support the mall. So my colleagues who live in New York or LA or Miami don't really understand what I'm talking about when I say the mall is dying in many American communities. It's the smaller towns that don't have the density and the wealth where you're really seeing, and we have too many malls. We built too many in the 70s and 80s, and now that's unraveled. Hi.
Valerie, Doug Fisher.
Doug Fisher is famous, by the way. I never took his class, but I know how hard it is.
But there's ramifications for journalism out of this, though,
Yeah.
too, because it's a symbiotic relationship between journalism and retail. What have you been picking up in your
It's a great question. The question is the ramification for journalism because of the symbiotic relationship between what generates our revenue, which has a long time been advertising, and retail, what's happening in retail. For the Wall Street Journal, our editor has said, you know, most industries would not survive if they had lost 40 to 50% of their revenue stream, which is what happened to us, he says, with the change in a full-page ad that used to say, you know, Tiffany, and now there are a lot fewer of those. The answer is I don't know, and I think it's a great question because journalism overall, the model, we haven't figured out the model, right? And it's been 10 years. You know, you think about it, it's been 10 years that, or more, that newsrooms have been really under big pressure. So I don't know the answer.
I guess I was just wondering, you know, in some of these places, they're further down the line on that.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything that suggests a future path here? Or how they're adjusting?
You know, I wish I could say that I have seen something that suggested in these communities that there was a future path, but not to that specific question. It's a very good one.
I'm just curious in all of your reporting, you know, all these brands are sitting on so much data consumers can see, you know, they're shopping on their website.
Yeah.
Are there any that have figured out how to take that knowledge, take that data of consumers shopping online, and figure out how to get them into their physical stores? Like what is going on there?
That's a great question. The question is, with all the consumer knowledge that these companies have, who's buying their product, have there been some smart strategies to try to get people into a physical store? And when you talk to the experts in the field, they say, look, you know, yes, retail changed a lot last year, but retail's been in transition since the beginning of retail. And I talked to a really smart guy that runs malls, and he said, we thought catalogs, we thought, you know, the catalogs, Land's End and J. Crew were going to kill, you know, retail 20 years ago. They didn't. We thought Barnes & Noble was going to kill bookstores. It didn't. So we're not that smart about predicting the future, is what he's trying to say. But if you had to predict the future, and this is a person that has been in the business a long time, he said there will still be physical stores because you who buy Warby Parker glasses want to try them on before you get 10 pairs sent to your house. We're seeing that. We're seeing that the digital natives like Bonobos, or you know, Untuckit, these stores that have products you want to touch and feel are opening physical locations where you can touch and feel them. You still order it. There's not inventory really in the store. So I think there is some learning about that. I'm not sure that it's, I'm not sure how widespread it is yet. But I do know that these companies have an awful lot of information that I have you in my shop, for sure. Rita.
Really small towns.
Yeah.
I mean, more than half of the towns in South Carolina are under 1,000 in population.
Yeah.
What about retail and Amazon and those, that hyperlocal example I love? Because
Yeah.
if you go into any small town, you're going to see something like that.
Yeah.
But have you seen any predictability about really small towns in this phenomenon?
I think it's uneven. I do. And the question is there any themes emerging in small towns in terms of what's going to take the place of the big retailers? I think it's like several of the examples I mentioned, like employment in particular, it's uneven. The towns that are doing well and have affluent people are going to have the little shops, and they have a farmer's market where you can get locally made tea and things like that. So, but in so many places that I go to, and we all go to, when you drive home to, you know, I don't know, Colleton County, or you see these little communities where there's not a lot. And one of the chicken and egg problems, the mayor of Elmira said to me, he's like, we lost retail downtown when it went to the mall. And now we're losing the mall, and we have nothing to build on downtown. And it's a symbiote, it's this hard problem to solve, especially in communities that are reliant on sales and property tax for a big part of their revenue stream. Yes?
I'm
I'm sorry.
I noticed recently that a lot of the retailers have become more event-driven. And I read something on Bergdorf's an article about how they were trying to keep their older base of customers and keeping their younger base. And I can tell you, I get emails from everybody about their events that they're having. And I think that's across different spectrums of retail.
Yeah.
I think that your very small mom and pop tends to do more events, but you're seeing your Bergdorfs and your Saks, shoot you an email, we've got this makeup specialist, or we've got this. But I'm interested in your
That's
comments
an
on
excellent
that.
point. The question is about events and things that retailers are doing on a large scale to try and get you physically there. And the loyalty programs are critical. You listen to the earnings calls and read the transcripts from these big corporations, and their loyalty program is a huge driver of their strategy. To the degree that they know whether you've walked into Nordstrom and bought anything this quarter, and if you haven't, we're going to invite you to a makeup demonstration. It is very sophisticated and intentional to try and create relationships between the outlet and the person. And I should mention, department stores, I think we all know, have been under pressure. A part of that's generational. There's Dr. Bickle, the head of the retail department here, had this interesting study where she analyzed who shops where. Baby boomers shop at department stores. If you gave baby boomers an option, they grew up going there, there's everything you could possibly want, like 59%, I think her research said, would choose to go to the department store. And millennials are the exact opposite. They would choose not to ever go to a department store, and similar numbers, like 60% would choose to go to an individual store. So I think the loyalty question also depends on who you're trying to get, and the direction that we're moving is towards these kids that want something that's very special.
Hey, I'm Jenny 30, and I'm from Fort Mill, South Carolina, which is a unique case in this study because it's Pleasant Grove, Charlotte, which
Yes.
is 12 miles north. The small town of Fort Mill has a lot of growth,
Yeah.
particularly on Main Street. So a lot of the Main Street businesses are now grappling with the idea of, hey, we want to benefit from a lot of the revenue that we're generating through
Yes.
sales tax. But it's a struggle between the town and the merchants to say, can we use some of this for promotion, for advertising?
Yeah.
How can we work together to make this cyclical to help us continue to generate revenue? And I think the merchants, that I only see their perspective from where I sit as a marketing consultant, but
Yeah.
I know that they feel that the
Yeah.
town could really do some great things to help. You see that as
It's a good question. It's about Fort Mill, where there's been a lot of prosperity as a result of being an exurb essentially of Charlotte, and the Main Street being really prosperous, and whether there should be some of those public dollars that are, some of the sales taxes generated by those stores, whether it should be used to build out the economy. It is a good problem to have. There are a lot of communities that I've been in that would welcome that problem. But I do think one of the things that Wausau did very successfully is just that. They devoted, they put a significant effort towards building their downtown, making sure that nothing stays vacant for very long, helping people that want to start out, like Allison. Where can you find a space? What can we do to broker that? And they've been very strategic about that. So it's a good problem to have. I think more cities wish they had. Yes, in the gray.
I'm wearing gray. Okay. I'm from Clinton, South Carolina. If you know where that is, yeah. So we're not Fort Mill. We don't really have much. I'm pretty okay, but like most of my friends that didn't go to college, I mean, they're working at Dollar General, they're working at Walmart, they work at part-time jobs. There are people who are grown and old and still work at part-time jobs at Belk and at Walmart and at Dollar General. I guess my question is, since retail will eventually probably change or go away to since we know it now in these larger department stores that they work at, what comes next? And what does that mean for things like home ownership and health care? These people don't have health care plans, they don't have any insurance. You know what I mean?
It's a great question, and it's about a town like Clinton, where retail really is a big employer for a lot of people, and stores like Dollar General, which are also, I should mention, is such a huge segment and growing segment of the business. Typically, retail jobs, the census data will tell you that when people leave a retail job, they go to another another low-wage job, sometimes like in the nursing field or in hospitality and restaurants, things like that. But again, it's very uneven. If there's no jobs to go to, you're not gonna, it's gonna be an issue. And I talked to a really smart professor who said, look, especially in a community like the one you're describing, it's a butterfly effect. It's not, so we don't shop at the store, so that person doesn't have a job. And then they don't go out and spend money. They're not generating sales tax, and potentially they might need public assistance. So it is a really complex problem that I think we haven't caught up yet how to solve. Good question. Yes.
Hi, Augie Grant from the faculty in the School of Journalism.
Hi.
You made an interesting allusion a minute ago to these two Americas, the America where the malls are failing and succeeding. That
Yeah.
parallels the two Americas that we've seen both on the political side. I heard another commentator refer to as you either have a Whole Foods or a Cracker Barrel, but rarely both at the same time.
Sometimes you'll have that.
What strikes me in reading your work and the stories you're telling is you're bridging that. Can you talk for a second about your role in the fact that there are these two, but you're looking across? Does a journalist play a role in bringing them together?
It's a great question, and the question is about the two Americas that are very real. I mean, we've seen it writ large in the past couple of years, and it's a journalism issue, and this is me talking. The numbers will show you that there are fewer paid people in journalism today than there were in the 1970s. That's it, and how much more is our country growing, how much more is the need for information, but fewer paid journalists providing it. And the research will also show you that the new jobs in journalism are in New York, Washington, and LA. So to your question, I take it very seriously. I take it as a heavy responsibility to say what I'm seeing in our communities is not sometimes what is reflected in the larger conversation. For example, I mean, there's a lot of our DC bureau talks a lot about a coming blue wave this year. There's going to be a blue wave. I'm like, I don't know. Does the evidence bear that out yet? Have you talked to people in communities? Because I'm not sure the evidence bears that out yet. I think we can get so far from each other if we don't hear each other. So I take it very seriously. I don't do enough to solve the problem. But it is, I think, one of the fundamental responsibilities I feel as a person from not New York. Yes?
I'm Elizabeth. I'm a sophomore and I'm from Washington, D.C. So my question is, you talked a lot about the economical part of malls closing, but have you done any look into the social aspects of it? Because I know, like, growing up and still now, like, when I go home, everybody goes to the mall and you run into other people you know there and catch up and talk. And then here, we don't go to the mall together. Like we were saying, you know, we're sitting next to each other on Amazon on our computers, like online shopping versus not the face-to-face with other people.
It's a great question. So what about the communal aspect of it? That we go to the mall on the weekend, and I was a kid that went to the mall on Friday evenings every weekend. It's hard to say because so much of, it's not the millennials. The millennial generation is born 1981 after, right? It's the generation which we don't know how to name yet. Post-millennials, Generation Z, have the digital life. There's not a real distinction between their digital life and their real life. So I'm not sure that there's any evidence that the cohort that's growing up now and the young millennials make much of the distinction between hanging out with you here in this room versus FaceTiming with you or texting with you. So I'm not sure as to the communal aspect whether that's something that we miss. I did talk to a student earlier today, he's 20, from Aiken, and I was like, when's the last time you went to the mall? He said, I went about 4 months ago to buy, I needed a party light, so I went to Spencer's. That's great. That makes sense to me. And I was like, before that, I was like, before that, when you go to the mall, and you have any habit of hanging out at the mall? He's like, you know, I go with my Nana. So my point is that there is a cohort, and a lot of us fall into it, that has some nostalgia and some emotion tied to going to the mall and hanging out at the mall and having that be a gathering place. But it's a very limited cohort. It's kind of baby boomers and Gen X, and maybe older millennials, and that's it. Everyone else, it's not kind of something that they miss all that much. Yes?
One thing about department stores, they're kind of just like places that brands are at. Like you go to a department store because there's like 10 different brands, and we don't see any decline in the amount of branding that's in our society. Everybody's still wearing the same brands.
Yeah.
Those brands haven't disappeared. They just kind of switched their sales to digital. From your experience, was it the brands that have been pressuring the large department stores from vacating the malls, or was it based off the profitability of the department stores themselves?
The question's about the relationship between brands and department stores and kind of who bears responsibility and for the health of the model, right? I don't know that I've seen research that's conclusive on that. I think it's become, with these long-term leasing arrangements that you read about with malls, the same goes for brands and malls. So I think there's a sense for some brands, from what we reported, that they're not getting what they agreed to pay for, so there's some tension there. But I'm not sure that there's that brand affinity has had a direct correlation with do you go buy it in a physical store. Yes.
Have you seen anything about sort of how ethnicity plays a role? I grew up north of Atlanta, so growing up, Lenox Square Mall, Buckhead was the big. Well, as time went by, Phipps was built.
Yeah.
Lenox became the black mall. Phipps was the white mall. In my hometown, the mall was where the Hispanic population started to develop, and so when I go home, it's like, well, it's all Hispanic. And so now we have some outlet malls near the interstate that are where the white folks go. And I was just wondering if you had done any research and sort of, let's be honest, ethnicity is a huge part of what's going on right now, politically and everything else.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything?
It's a good question, and the question is, is there differences among ethnicities, and I would also say socioeconomic ranges on which malls are thriving. I will say one funny thing about Phipps and Lenox, if y'all have been there. The family that owns the mall in Elmira is like, people may feel sorry for me and my little mall. I feel sorry for Lenox, and that because they're so over mall. The mall community in Atlanta's having far too many malls for the population. But in terms of that question, I think what we've reported on a lot lately is malls that are thriving in other countries. So malls are booming in Mexico. They're safe environments. They're communal. The middle class is rising quickly there compared to the stagnation that we've seen in other developed countries. So I think in terms of ethnicity, the reporting I have seen says in countries where there's a rising middle class and a need to go to a place, same can be said for, we had a great story, I didn't write it, we had a great story last week about malls in China going to gangbusters. So in this country, I think it's a question about, it gets back to the Dollar General question, how much money do you have to spend, and how easy is it or hard is it for you to get to a mall, as much as a ethnic one.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
As someone who has, on the pulse of, what makes malls thrive, what's the best food court you've ever seen? What's the worst that you thought, just how is this not closed?
I love this question. The question is, what is the best food court you've ever seen, and what's the worst? I'll answer it this way. So, the mall in Wausau, Wisconsin. There are two restaurants in the food court. The Subway couldn't make it. The Subway closed down, put it that way. There's two restaurants in the food court. One is a Chinese barbecue, and one is, there's a significant Laotian population and Hmong population in that part of Wisconsin. So it's a Laotian restaurant, and larb is the traditional noodle they serve, and the restaurant's called Let's Get Larbed. It was all I could do not to buy a t-shirt. I would not have expensed it, but really. So I think it's a good question. I have little kids, so the food court specialties I'm most familiar with are Chick-fil-A and Dippin' That's a good question. And I'd just like to close by thank you guys so much for coming out to hear me, and also for supporting business journalism. It is never, and journalism in general, it's never been more important to do. It's never been more important to our conversation. The business has never been under such pressures. We need our readers, and we need your trust. So I want to thank you, and I also want to say,